From the beginning, Destiny has distinguished itself from its competitors by offering up an amazing gameplay experience, with crispy gunplay that few in the gaming industry can match, as well as movement systems that make simple traversal throughout the worlds a fun experience all on its own. You can always count on Destiny being a fun game to play. Sure, PvP isn't always the best experience, especially when obnoxious meta weapons or abilities take hold, but the PvE Sandbox has been the glue that has held Destiny together these last 7 years. There isn't a much better feeling in gaming than heading out into Destiny's worlds and popping alien skulls with your buddies. For most of Destiny's lifespan, combat in PvE has been relatively the same, with rank-and-file red bar enemies, elite orange bar enemies, major level yellow bar enemies, and then fully fledged bosses. However, back at the launch of Shadowkeep, Bungie introduced a new tier of enemy to the PvE Sandbox: champions. Champions exist between majors and bosses, boasting unique abilities and needing specific weapons or abilities to take them down. On paper, champions sound like an excellent addition to the game. They represent another fail state that a fire team needs to take on together in order to succeed, and the current champions in the game are tooled in such a way to be vulnerable to different weapons and abilities each season to make them feel dynamic and fresh over time. But while looking good on paper, there are a number of problems with the current implementation of champions in the game today. From very little player agency in choosing how to combat these champions, to a number of weapons that just don't work well with anti-champion mods, and the utter lack of creative mechanics involved with champions leaves a lot to be desired. In this video, I'm going to explain how I would revamp champions. We're going to discuss how barrier, overload, and unstoppable champions can be reworked to make them more fair and give players more agency in how they combat them, and we will then discuss new champion types that could be added to the game, a new crop of deadly foes driven by mechanics instead of a simple gear check. Let's jump in. So, let's jump right in and discuss how we can redesign barrier, overload, and unstoppable champions to make them feel like worthy parts of the PvE Sandbox, and less like cheap gimmicks that frustrate you on a seasonal basis. The number one complaint that I see levied at the current crop of champions in the game is the fact that you have no control over what weapons and abilities can be used to fight them in a given season. You are left completely at the mercy of what Bungie chooses to put in the seasonal artifact. There is simply no combat foundation that you can depend upon each season to fight champions. To remedy this, I propose a pretty simple but effective solution. I propose that elemental abilities should be able to stun champions, with each of the 3 elements being able to stun a different type of champion. To be clear, this would mean melees, grenades, and supers would all be fair game as anti-champion tools. And you may be saying, but Kujay, there are 4 elements in Destiny now: Solar, Arc, Void, and Stasis. And technically you'd be correct. However, I think that Stasis and the next 2 Darkness subclasses that are coming in the Witch Queen and Lightfall are going to be dark mirrors of the 3 light-based subclasses. Look at Solar, which is heat energy, whereas Stasis is the complete lack of all heat energy, hence the freezing. We're getting into speculation territory, but I bet that in the Witch Queen, we'll be getting a corruption subclass to act as the inverse of arc energy. And in Lightfall, I bet that we're going to get a gravity-based subclass to be the inverse of void energy, seeing as the pyramid ships have demonstrated gravity wave powers across multiple lore entries. The point of this tangent is that for each light-based subclass, there is an equal but opposite darkness subclass linked to it, and each pair would be able to stun a specific type of champion. Thus, I propose that Solar and Stasis abilities would be able to stun barrier champions, Arc and Corruption would be able to stun overload champions, and Void and Gravity would be able to stun unstoppable champions. There are already a ton of ranged Solar melee abilities like the Titan's Throwing Hammer, Hunter's Throwing Knives, and Top Tree Dawn's Celestial Fire that would be excellent barrier breakers. As for arc, think of that element as short-circuiting an Overload champion and thus shutting down its health regen. And for void and gravity, what better to halt something dubbed unstoppable than one of the fundamental movement forces in the universe. Lore justifications aside, letting elemental abilities have anti-champion properties would create a consistent anchor with which to fight champions every season, with the seasonal artifact dishing out different weapons each season to shake up the meta, which Bungie has stated to be one of their primary goals, with sunsetting now out of the game. Not to mention the fact that this would put an end to the need for double primary weapons and match-made activities with champions, as solo players could choose one primary weapon for one champion type and then rely on their subclass for the other champion type present in the activity. No more D2 Year 1 loadout requirements because of clueless blueberries not running anti-champion mods. With the primary issue regarding champions corrected, let's now discuss some quality of life changes to make champion combat a more fun and less obnoxious experience. First off, I think that any anti-champion weapon perks that you select in the seasonal artifact should then just work, with no need to then go equip a mod of the perk you just selected and put it on your gauntlets. This would help to streamline the experience and provide some relief to the gauntlet mod slots that are already saturated with tons of other good mod choices. And yes, while this does make things easier, since you wouldn't have to waste mod points or sockets to be able to fight champions, the true purpose behind barrier, overload, and unstoppable champions from a design perspective is that they are gear check champions that Bungie wants to have different counters to every season. This goal would still be accomplished and would reduce the amount of tedious mod changing that plagues Armor 2.0 as a whole. The next quality of life change I'd implement is to make all anti-champion weapons equally effective. Right now, there are a number of anti-champion weapon types that are woefully ineffective. Overload Auto Rifle and Overload SMG are particularly egregious, and that you have to unload an entire magazine to get a stun off, and even then it sometimes won't proc. This is even worse when most Overload champions teleport around like it's an anime, causing you to miss the critical Overload round that stuns the bitch. Please make Overload rounds consistently good for all weapon types, Bungie. That ain't asking much. And for unstoppable weapons, it feels like half the time the primed shot just won't stun a champion, and this inconsistency can absolutely ruin a run. Please fix this, Bungie. Next up, I think that Overload and Unstoppable champions should be updated to be more visually obvious as to when they can be stunned, and have this coincide with when Overload champions start regaining health and when Unstoppable champions regain their increased damage resistance. Let's walk through how this champion cycle would work. Overload and Unstoppable champions would glow in a more obvious manner when you first encounter them. Then, upon stunning the champion, they would dim and hunch over, which is when you wail into them with all you've got. Then, the stunned champion would get back up, so to speak, and begin either teleporting once again or restarting their charge right at you. During this time, the champion would still be dimmed out, it would not regain health or have increased damage resistance, but you would not yet be able to re-stun the champion. This way, the champion is still threatening and not able to be perma-stunned, but they are also still fair and killable. Then, after a short time, the champion would begin glowing again like when they were first encountered. Upon glowing, the enemy will either begin to regen their health or regain their increased damage resistance. When the enemy is glowing, that is when they can be re-stunned. And that would be the champion cycle for Overloads and Unstoppables. Full power, then stunned and immobile, then stunned but mobile, and then back to full power. And finally, let's address and smooth over any bullshit elements of champions that feel either buggy or overtuned. On the barrier champion front, we have Vex Hobgoblins, Hive Knights, Cabal Colossi, and Fallen Servitors. Hobgoblins and Knights are both pretty fair enemies to fight and don't really need any changes. Colossi, on the other hand, can dish out extreme amounts of damage very quickly and from very far distances. Perhaps a slight damage nerf would be acceptable here, and Servitors need the most readjusting. Right now, they can make all enemies nearby immune, just like normal non-champion Servitors. The problem is, the immunity tether goes through walls to protect all nearby enemies at all times. Especially in tight rooms with lots of cover, barrier servitors can simply hide behind said cover and grant immunity to a small army in between the player and the champion. I think that if barrier servitors could only tether to enemies it has a direct line of sight to, this champion would be far more fair to fight. On the Overload champion front, we have Taken Hobgoblins, Vex Minotaurs, and Fallen Captains. Taken Hobgoblins are pretty well balanced, as they're stationary and usually engage from range. Their only gimmick is that if you hit them with non-overload damage, they'll begin their retaliation swarm and bombard you for a few seconds. Again, not too difficult to deal with. Minotaurs, however, teleport around and usually push right into you, acting in many ways like an unstoppable champion, but with health regen. But with the champion cycle that we talked about a little while ago, I think that Overload Minotaurs would be in a fine state, as the main problem with them right now is that once they recover from being stunned, they begin charging at you again and start regaining health, and you can't stun them for an undesignated period of time. With the new champion cycle, there wouldn't be any more oppressive health regen happening until the champion is once again stunnable. Captains are perhaps the most bullshit champion type to fight, with them teleporting all over the place like they're in an anime. But I think that the new champion cycle would be enough to subdue Overload Captains and make them a fair enemy to fight. The only additional change I would make is to slightly reduce the frequency of the captain's teleporting ability. Seriously, this shouldn't be possible, Bungie. And on the Unstoppable champion front, we have Hive Ogres, Cabal Incendiars, and Taken Phalanxes. Honestly, both Ogres and Incendiars are pretty fair to fight against today, with the only real issue being inconsistent unstoppable weapons, which we addressed earlier. And for Taken Phalanxes, right now they can kill you by simply having their shield touch you. No, not swing at you with the shield, not blast you with the shield, straight up, if shield makes contact with player dies. This honestly feels like a bug that needs to be stamped out. No other champion in the game can do this. And with all of these changes to our current gear check champions, I think that the player experience when combating these challenging enemies would be much more fun and far more fair, and would live up to Bungie's stated goal of shifting the meta in the game's most challenging activities. Now, let's discuss new, mechanics-driven champions that could be added to the game to take combat and PvE to the next level. Now that we've discussed how Bungie can improve upon the game's current gear check champions, let's talk about new champion types that Bungie could add to the game. To me, there is a big hole with Bungie's design goals for champions, and that's the fact that there are almost no champions that are difficult to fight or intimidating to face because of their mechanics. I think that if the game had an equal number of gear check champions that have a seasonally rotating weapon meta to face them, in addition to more permanent mechanics-driven champions, there would be a lot less animosity towards the concept of champions as a whole. Really, champions are meant to be another way for the player to lose. That isn't just more enemies or more health. Ironically, the champions that are the most hated are the ones that Bungie gave mechanics to, be it barrier servitors shielding nearby enemies, or fallen captains getting enhanced teleportation abilities. But when a champion has both difficult mechanics and is also a gear check, with different weapons needed to fight them each season, it makes sense why those two champions in particular are so hated. Champions need to be either gear check or mechanics driven, not both for them to feel fair to fight. With all that said, what would new mechanics driven champions even look like? What could Bungie throw at us that is both a sufficient threat, but also not completely overtuned? Personally, I think that Bungie could very easily fall back on some tried and true mechanics from raids of the past, but now pushed out to the masses. And before you cry out, "But Kujay, you can't just put old raid mechanics out into non-raid content?" What if I told you that Bungie has already done this? What if I told you that one of the most beloved activities in the Destiny franchise's history was a compilation of encounters that were almost all built using mechanics from old raids? That activity was the Menagerie. The Hunt, where you stand on plates and hold out against hordes of Hive, sounds a lot like the bridge encounter of Crota's End. The Gauntlet, an almost exact replication of the Gauntlet encounter of the Leviathan raid. The Crystals, where you use Vex craniums to destroy Vex crystals, sounds a lot like Argos Phase 1 and 2 from Eater of Worlds to me. And the Arcborn, where you run through 3 different pillars of energy, and then dunk a full charge at a receptacle looks a lot like the opening encounter of Wrath of the Machine to me. The point being, while some raid mechanics are definitely too intense to be unleashed onto the wider player base, it has been demonstrated to great effect that milder raid mechanics can not only be used for non-raid content, but that more often than not, the vast majority of the player base loves it when Bungie does this. So, with that tangent out of the way, I propose that 3 new mechanics-driven champion types get added to the game. This would provide a balance between gear check champions and mechanics-driven champions, with each having 3 apiece. I would dub these new champions as Succubus, Armored, and Oracle champions. Let's dive into the design of Succubus champions first. Succubus champions would have the lowest amount of health out of the 3 new champions, but would have the most frequent ability to regain health. The primary mechanic of Succubus champions would be that after they detect a player, they would begin a draining ritual that would start draining the melee, grenade, class ability, and super energy from all guardians in the instance. The longer this draining ritual continues, the faster the ability energy will be siphoned away. When a player has no ability energy left to be drained, the Succubus champion would then begin draining the player's health until they die. Note that it would take a good chunk of time for a Succubus champion to actually kill a player, so it wouldn't feel like a cheap shot. The point is that a fire team can't ignore a Succubus champion once it begins a draining ritual, and represents a wipe scenario if the champion isn't stunned. While the Succubus champion is performing a draining ritual, the champion would be regaining health at a proportional rate to which the player's ability, energy, and health is being drained. Something something law of equivalent exchange, something something. To stun a Succubus champion while they're performing a draining ritual, all the player would have to do is pump a large enough amount of damage into the champion in a short period of time. Note that the Succubus champion would have increased damage resistance while performing their draining ritual. That way you can't just nuke them and make them a non-threat. After stunning a Succubus champion, they would then remain immobile for a brief period and take normal amounts of damage. Then, similar to our proposed rework of Overload and Unstoppable champions, they would begin to move around and attack like a normal enemy until enough time has passed that they can begin a new draining ritual. Then, the cycle repeats until either the champion is defeated or the fire team is wiped. Destiny has actually seen a milder version of this mechanic before, and ironically enough, it wasn't even a raid mechanic. For veterans who played the Taken King campaign back in the day, this should have all sounded quite familiar, because it's essentially a beefed up version of the drain mechanic used by Oryx in the final boss fight of the campaign against him. Oryx would occasionally begin a ritual and raise his sword into the air and start draining your super energy, and you had to pump enough damage into him to end the super drain. There was also a variation of this mechanic used by the Shade of Oryx boss in the Reckoning, but instead of ability drain, not pumping enough damage into the Shade would cause him to wipe the entire fire team. That was okay though, because you had automatic revives in the Reckoning. In high-level PvE content like GM Nightfalls, where Extinguish is on and you get sent back to orbit when your team wipes, I think a full instantaneous team wipe would just be too strong. Hence why I proposed an initial drain of ability energy first that slowly ramps up and then eventually starts draining player health. If a fire team ignores a Succubus champion long enough for everyone to die, you honestly deserve the wipe. With these mechanics in place, let's discuss which enemy types could become Succubus champions. My goal with identifying which enemy types should become my 3 new champion types is twofold. 1, make all these new champions out of enemy types that are not currently Barrier, Overload, or Unstoppable champions. And 2, have 2 new champion types per race. i.e. the Hive could get a Succubus champion and an Oracle champion, which I'll discuss in just a little bit. The Vex could get an Armored champion and an Oracle champion, and so on. For the Succubus champions, I think that Hive Wizards, Cabal Scions, and Taken Vandals would all fit nicely as more magical or mobile enemies that make sense as energy or health drainers. Hive Wizards with their magic, and Cabal Scions with their psychic powers, and Taken Vandals with the Taken power granted by the darkness. Now, let's discuss the next champion type I would add to the game, Armored champions. Armored champions would have the highest amount of health out of the 3 new champion types, but would have no ability to regain health, just like Unstoppable champions. The primary mechanic of Armored champions would be that they are shielded from all damage until their weak spots are all damaged and destroyed. Once the weak spots have been destroyed, the armored champion would be damageable, albeit with a high health pool to make them feel like walking tanks. The secondary mechanic of armored champions would be that while their shields are up, they would empower all nearby enemies and buff their damage by 20%. Think of this as being an offensive-oriented mirror of barrier servitors today, which make all nearby enemies immune to damage. To stun an armored champion, the player would need to do enough damage to each of their weak points to destroy them all. These weak points would be immune to ability damage and explosive damage, requiring normal weapon damage to destroy them. This feature would be in place to prevent a simple grenade, super, or explosion from a rocket or grenade launcher from being able to immediately destroy all the weak spots with a single attack. Like with other champions, an armored champion would be temporarily immobile after destroying the weak spots, and then after a brief time would become mobile and start attacking once again, and then finally, the armored champion's immunity shield and weak spots would come back online, and the cycle would start anew. Destiny has played with this immune until weak spots are destroyed mechanic a number of times in previous raids. The first example is the Berserkers from Scourge of the Past, which required one player to shoot a weak spot on the enemy's chest, and another player to shoot a weak spot on the enemy's back to make the Berserker susceptible to damage. Another example is the final boss of Scourge, Insurrection Prime, which had 6 shield generators that had to be destroyed for the boss to be stunned into a damage phase. And the third and final example of this kind of mechanic being used previously was by the final boss of Garden of Salvation. While the Sanctified Mind's weak spots weren't part of damaging the boss directly and were instead used for opening up portals, it still serves as an example of special weak points on an otherwise immune enemy. With these mechanics in place, let's discuss which enemy types could become armored champions. I think that Vex Wyverns, Fallen Brigs, Cabal Centurions, and Taken Knights would all fit nicely as tank or commander style enemies that make sense as heavily armored behemoths that command and buff nearby enemy units. Vex Wyverns are the first Vex units specifically designed for combat that we've encountered. Fallen Brigs are literal Gundams with a commanding servitor inside. Cabal Centurions are commanders of legionary squads, and Taken Knights are the apex Taken Predators, seeing as they are Hive Knights, which were near the top of the Hive hierarchy, but now with Taken powers granted by the Darkness. And finally, the third champion type that I would add is Oracle Champions. Oracle Champions would have a moderate amount of health, somewhere in between Succubus and Armored Champions, and would have a limited ability to regain health. The primary mechanic of Oracle Champions would be that after they detect a player, they would spawn Darkness-themed oracles spread throughout the area that they inhabit. At the same time, one player chosen at random in the instance will now have a debuff called Mark of Darkness that will start at 15 seconds and begin counting down to 0. If all the Darkness oracles are not destroyed before the Mark of Darkness timer reaches 0, the marked player will be killed, and the Oracle Champion will regain all health, as they are consuming the light of the dead Guardian. While the Darkness oracles are active, the Oracle Champion will also have increased damage resistance. That way you can't just nuke the champion and ignore the mechanic. To stun an Oracle Champion, the player would need to destroy all 4 Darkness oracles spread throughout the area. Unlike the weak spots of Armored Champions, Darkness oracles would be susceptible to all sources of damage, be it weapon or ability, since they aren't all clumped up near each other. Like with other champions, an Oracle Champion would be temporarily immobile after all the Darkness oracles have been destroyed, and then after a brief time would become mobile and start attacking like usual, and then finally the Oracle Champion would regain their increased damage resistance and they would spawn 4 new Darkness oracles, starting the combat cycle anew. Destiny has made use of this Oracle mechanic a number of times, but was used most prominently in the OG raid Vault of Glass. In Vault of Glass, Vex oracles would spawn in during encounters, and if the players did not destroy them in time, the entire fire team would be wiped. For D1 raids, where revives were either limited or outright removed in hard mode, this mechanic was punishing but manageable, as you were in a pre-made 6-man group. For Oracle champions to see usage beyond just raids, I think it's fair to have the Darkness Oracles only kill a single person instead of all players in the instance, especially with Extinguish being active in content like GM Nightfalls. With these mechanics in place, let's discuss which enemy types could become Oracle champions. I think that Vex Hydras, Hive Acolytes, and Fallen Heavy Shanks would all fit nicely as specialty units with the ability to focus kill individual guardians. The original user of the Oracle mechanic, the Templar from Vault of Glass, was simply a big Vex Hydra, so that's an obvious fit for this champion type. A Hive Acolyte could come to wield this power of the darkness through their intense study of Hive Arcana, and as for Fallen Heavy Shanks, yeah, this is the one champion suggestion that I don't have a great lore backing for, but it's one of the only enemy variants left at this point without a champion version, so screw it. Champion Shanks it is. And just like that, we've come to the end of another video. Hopefully you guys all enjoyed this latest installment and how we can continue to evolve Destiny 2. Champions have been one of the more controversial elements of the game since their debut back in Shadowkeep. With your options to combat them locked to the whims of the seasonal artifact, it's completely understandable why players have always been frustrated by them, especially when a large chunk of weapons don't function particularly well with some anti-champion mods. With the reworks that I've proposed, not only would subclass elements remain an anchor point throughout the seasons when battling the current batch of gear check champions, but we'd also see an infusion of new champions enter the scene, and this batch of deadly foes would be countered by mechanics, not by having Bungie's chosen weaponry forced into your hands. And with all that said, that's going to be it from me this week. I've got a date with double Nightfall loot this weekend, and that Adept Palindrome is calling my name. I'll be streaming my GM runs over on Twitch for a large part of the weekend, so feel free to drop on by and have a good time. And as always, if you want to support this channel, make sure to leave a comment down below, drop a like, and hit that sub button. Have a wonderful week, guys, and I hope to catch you all in the next one. This has been your host, Kujay. Cheers.